The metropolitan province of Shemsdin, created after the 1552 schism in the Church of the East, was the second most important ecclesiastical province of the Qudshanis patriarchate after the province of the patriarch himself. The metropolitans or mutrans of Shemsdin traditionally took the name Hnanishoʿ and lived in the Shemsdin village of Mar Ishoʿ in the sub-district of Rustaqa. There were around 12 metropolitans of Shemsdin between the 16th and 20th centuries, most of whom were chosen by hereditary succession. The last metropolitan of Shemsdin, Mar Yosip Khnanisho, died in Iraq in 1977, and the office of mutran lapsed on his death. Background: after the schism of 1552, most of the East Syrian Christians living the Hnanishoʿ and regions gave their loyalty to the Shemon line of patriarchs, who fixed the seat in the 17th century in the Hnanishoʄ village of Qudshanis, a few miles to the northeast of Julimurk. The Nestorian population of these regions was estimated by the Anglican missionary Louis Cutts in 1877 at 10,638 families. There was also a large Chaldean Catholic community in the Salmis district, perhaps 10,000 strong, whereas the Mosul patriarchs were simply religious leaders, whose succession depended on the agreement of the Ottoman authorities. The Qudshanis patriarchs were also quasi-independent tribal chiefs, enjoying a certain freedom of maneuver to balance between the Ottoman authorities and the nominally subject Kurdish emirs. This dual position gave the Qudshanis patriarchate a unique character. 19th-century visitors to Qudshanis described a patriarchal rule which resembled that of a medieval baron. The patriarch derived an income from the farm produce of his parishioners, and took a share of church collections. His rule ultimately rested on the prestige of the patriarchal family, which was recognized by all the East Syrians in the patriarchate, and it was common for them to swear an oath by the head of Mar Ishoʿin. As in the Mosul patriarchate, hereditary succession was customary by the 19th century, and each patriarch would consecrate a guardian of the throne, normally a nephew, from a pool of younger relations, who lived an ascetic communal existence as Naziretes. The Qudshanis patriarchate had about a dozen dioceses in the 19th century, divided between the Syrian, Bukhari and Hnanishoʄ regions in Turkey and the Urmi region in Persia. The patriarch was assisted by a senior metropolitan or mutran, invariably named Hnanishoʄ, in charge of the large diocese of Shemsdin in the Hnanishoʄ region, who deputized for him and enjoyed a prestige and power second only to his own. Metropolitans of Shemsdin. Between the 5th and the 14th centuries, the Shemsdin district was included in the diocese of Beth-Bigash in the province of Adiabene. The diocese of Shemsdin was created after the schism of 1552, probably by the second Catholic patriarch Abdashoh IV, probably a deformation of Shapatan, the Shemsdin district. The metropolitan Hnanishoʄ of Rustaqa, Tehran and Urmi, dependent on the third Catholic patriarch Shemon Atyar-Balaha, is mentioned in a colophon of 1577. A metropolitan of Sepithgai, named Hnanishoʄ, probably the same man, was one of the signatories of a letter of 1580 from the fourth Catholic patriarch Shemon I to Pope Gregory XIII. The Patriarch Elia VIII, in response to a request from the Vatican, provided information on the composition of the rival East Syrian hierarchies in two reports, made in 1607 and 1610 respectively. The report of 1610 mentions the metropolitan Hnanishoʄ of Solotam, dependent on the patriarch Shemon X, and the bishop Joseph of Solotam, dependent on Eliad and possibly to be identified with the bishop Joseph of Rustaqa mentioned in 1607. One or more metropolitans of Shemsdin named Hnanishoʿ are mentioned together with the patriarch Shemon in colophons of 1680 and 1715 and in a series of 5 colophons from 1724 to 1732, all from the Turgawad district, and a manuscript was copied in 1700 by the priest Habel, son of the priest Hoshaba, cousin of the patriarch Mar Ishoʿin and the metropolitan Mar Hnanishoʿ. A manuscript was copied in 1730 by the priest David, metropolitan Natakasia of Shemsdin, presumably a nephew of the metropolitan Hnanishoʿ. There are several other 18th-century references to metropolitans of Shemsdin. A metropolitan Hnanishoʿ of Rustaqa is mentioned in colophons of 1743 and 1745, associated with the patriarchs Mar Shemon V and Mar Elia, respectively. A metropolitan named Hnanishoʿ, who lives in Mar Ishoʿ of Rustaqa, is mentioned in a colophon of 1761 from the Turgawad district. A metropolitan of Shemsdin named Hnanishoʿ is mentioned in colophons of 1786, 1815 and 1818. A metropolitan of Shemsdin named Hnanishoʿ was mentioned by the Anglican missionary George Percy Badger in 1850. There is another large district in central Kurdistan, inhabited by Nestorians, called Shemsdin, under the episcopal jurisdiction of Mar Ishoʿin and Yeshua, who resides at Rustaqa. The metropolitan of this province for the time being consecrates the patriarch. He has 3 suffragans, whose dioceses include the districts of Tergawa, Margawa, Samava, Bradosani, and Mahmudiyya. Badger's Hnanishoʿ seems to have been succeeded by the metropolitan Joseph Khnanisho in 1864, who is last mentioned in 1884 by Riley. He was succeeded in 1884 by Isaac Khnanisho, who died in Kermanshah in 1918 during the arduous flight to Hamadan. Isaac Khnanisho was succeeded as mutran in April 1919 by his nephew Joseph Khnanisho, who was consecrated a bishop at the age of 32 on the 10th of August 1914 by the patriarch Shemon 19 Benjamin. He was among the bishops who escaped to Iraq in 1918, where he spent the rest of his life. He fixed his residence at Hara, and after the exile of the patriarch Shemon 21 Ishoʿ in 1933 effectively became the head of the East Syrian Church in Iraq. He died in Baghdad on 3 July 1977, and the Diocese of Shemsdin lapsed after his death. Further details. The following table, taken from the article Mutran family of Shemsdin, provides further details on the metropolitans of Shemsdin. Although its provenance is not clear, the details it provides tally with the information given in earlier paragraphs, and it may derive from a reliable source. The 10 mutrans listed were all members of the Gidda family, perhaps originally from Erbil. According to tradition, the first mutran, Sargis, migrated to Shemsdin from the village of Dar and Amp Kamain in the Sapna Valley near Ahmadiyya, settling for a while in the Nowhere village of Ali. He was a cousin of the patriarch Shemon 13 Dena, who consecrated him metropolitan of Shemsdin in 1663. The 16th and early 17th century metropolitans of Shemsdin had been chosen in accordance with the canon law of the Church of the East, by uniate patriarchs in communion with Rome, but the appointment of Sargis marked a return to the old custom of hereditary succession in the Qudshanis patriarchate. All subsequent metropolitans of Shemsdin were appointed from members of the Gidda family. Suffragan dioceses. Badger mentioned in 1850 that the mutran had 3 suffragan bishops, responsible for the Tergawa, Mergawa and Baradas districts, but did not mention the names. A few years later the mutran had 3 suffragan bishops, Sabrisho of Gawa, Yohanan of Tuleki, and Dena of Tis, mentioned by Cutts in 1877, by McLean and Brown in 1884 and by Riley in 1888, and by several other sources. 2 of the 3 may well have been consecrated as early as 1850, but the third was a very young man, not more than 25, in 1877, and could not have been a bishop for more than about a decade at most. Although all 3 men worked primarily within the mutrans diocese of Shemsdin and Tergawa, their dioceses were ad personam and not territorial, the responsibilities not clearly defined, and the formal titles uncertain. The bishop Sabrisho of Gawa was responsible for the southern half of the Gawa plain and a few upland villages in Persia near Urmi. He is last mentioned in 1901, when a group of East Syrians at Urmi, disenchanted with the Russian missionaries, wrote to the Archbishop of Canterbury to propose forming a separate church under his leadership. The Bishop Yohanan of Tuleki, or of Shemsdin, was responsible only for the village of Tuleki in Tergawa, which had been detached some years earlier from the diocese of Shemsdin. His brother Dena of Tuleki was the archdeacon of the mutran, and was described by the Anglican Mission in 1893 as a bishop without diocese. He may have had some responsibility beyond his own village, as he is mentioned in a colophon of 1895 from the nearby village of Syr in the Barandas district. He died shortly before 1911 and was described by the Anglican missionary William Angel Wigram as a feeble old man, noted only for possessing in his house the fiercest fleas in all Mergawa. The Bishop Dena of Tis or of Tergawa is first mentioned in 1862 as one of the signatories of Zofna's report. His diocese consisted only of the Shemsdin village of Tis, detached like Tuleki from the mutrans diocese. For several years before 1909 he was responsible for those East Syrians in and around Urmi who did not join the Russian Orthodox Church, and in 1909 was transferred to the Saldas district. He was among a group of 45 East Syrian Christians executed by the Turkish army after its capture of Urmi in 1915, after an unsuccessful attempt by the Anglican missionary Nissen to ransom him. Topographical survey. The Shemsdin district lay south of Gawa and east of Sat, with Dash to its east and Bradas to its south, along the upper reaches of the Shamdin and Neri River, and was centered on the small town of Neri. Besides the Shemsdin district itself, which was part of Hakkari province, the ecclesiastical province of Shemsdin included the Shirwan, Bradast, Rawandas and Deranai districts and the lower Gawa plain in eastern Turkey, and the Tergawa and Mergawa districts just across the border in Persia. The Shirwan, Bradast and Rawandas districts are now in Iraq. According to the Anglican missionary George Percy Badger, the Shemsdin district and the Urmi region together contained 4,500 East Syrian families, with 34 priests and 38 churches, in 1850. It is clear from other sources for the population of the Urmi region that this estimate was too low. In 1877 Edward Cutts listed 26 East Syrian villages in the Shemsdin district, containing 626 East Syrian families with 22 churches. Unusually, he did not record which villages had priests. This list can be conveniently consulted in David Wilmshurst's study, The Ecclesiastical Organization of the Church of the East, 1318 to 1913, published in 2000. A recently published bilingual book by U.L. Barber has supplied the Syriac names of all of the villages mentioned by Quds. There are a number of minor orthographical divergences between the names of the villages as given by Quds, Wilmshurst and Barber, but the three lists can be readily matched. The most curious feature of Barber's list is that it gives the name Shapid for the important village of Shipat. Besides being a village name, Shipat was also an alternative name for the Shemsdin district, and the variant forms Shipat and Shapatan and the corresponding adjective Shapatnaya are amply attested in manuscript colophons. Popular memory has preserved the names of many of the churches mentioned by Quds and perhaps some built later than 1877, including the churches of St. John the Baptist and Mar Ishoʿ in the village of Bediwi, the church of Mar Ishoʿin in Biltunyo, the church of Mar Ishoʿ in Halana, the churches of Mar Ishoʿin and Mar Christopher in Hnanishoʿ, the church of Mar Ishoʿin in Qudshanis, the church of Mar Ishoʿ in Rustaqa, and the church of Mar Ishoʄ in Tis. Scribal activity in the Shemsdin district. A respectable number of manuscripts have survived from the Shemsdin district, particularly from the 18th century. The earliest surviving manuscripts from the district come from the end of the 16th century. A manuscript of 1582 copied by the scribe Gawagis, son of Shamso, in the church of Mar Ishoʄ and Mar Christopher in Hnanishoʄ, and a manuscript of 1601 copied in the Turgawa village of Razga by the priest Joseph, son of the priest Hormizd, son of Durbaz, son of Niazar of Shipat, for the pilgrim Darwish of the tribe of the Beit Imne, who gave it to the church of Mar Ishoʄin in the village of Rustaqa. No other manuscripts have survived from the 17th century, but several were copied in the 18th century. In 1724 by the deacon Aziz of Qudshanis, in 1730 by the priest David, in 1743 by the priest Safar, son of Ishoʄ, of Beth Dawi, in 1745 by an unknown scribe, in 1746 by the priest Shapur in the church of Mar Ishoʄ in Bediwi, in 1747 by the priest Eliar of Bediwi, and in 1761 and 1786 by the priest Jalabi, son of Hosho, son of Hazo, of Bediwi, in its church of Mar Ishoʄ and John the Baptist. Several 19th-century manuscripts were copied by Shemsdin scribes. In 1804 in the church of Mar Ishoʄ and Mar Ishoʄ in the unlocalized village of Rabnath by the priest Zerwandad, son of Safar. In 1819 in Ashitha by the priest Habel of the Mutrans family. In 1826 by Zerwandad, son of Safar. In 1846 by the priest Denner of Nerdosha, and in 1850 in Bethlehem by the pilgrim Abraham of Guardian. Several other details on the Shemsdin district have been preserved. After the schism of 1552 the village of Rustaqa, also known as Mar Ishoʄ, was the traditional residence of the mutran Hnanishoʄ. The village was named for Ishoʄ, the brother of the monk Bahishoʄ of Kamel. According to Fi'i, the church of Qudshanis was dedicated to Mar Ishoʄ, identified by the villagers with the 4th century patriarch Shemon bar Sabari, but perhaps rather Mar Ishoʄ, disciple of Mar Yonan the slave. A monastery of Mar Ishoʄ, located near Rustaqa, and therefore to be sought in the Shemsdin district, is mentioned in a number of manuscript colophons between the 16th and 19th centuries. The monastery is first mentioned in 1599, when a manuscript was copied for its superior the priest Wilder, son of the deacon Mush. The bishop Bishop Johannan of Ansel, who died shortly before 1755, is mentioned as the monastery's superior in colophons of 1804 and 1815, and is said to have built Mar Ishoʿ on the border of Darun in a colophon of 1824, implying that he was responsible for restoring the monastery. The colophon of a manuscript of 1826 by his nephew the priest Zerwandad, son of Safar, mentions that the scribe came from the village of Mar Ishoʿ of Shemsdin. A manuscript copied in 1897 in Urmi mentions the mutrans Archdeacon Denner of Tuleki, archdeacon of the monastery of Mar Ishoʄ by Rustaqa.